Could you explain further how a vocation to celibacy after Adam and Eve still looks to human marriage as a model for their relationship with God? Great question. So, we said that man is a spousal creature by nature, and that applies to all. It applies to those who are called to marriage and those who are called to religious life or the priesthood. All of us are spousal, and that spousal nature will be realized in those two fundamental ways, in marriage or in religious life or priesthood. In other words, in marriage or celibacy. And in celibacy, the celibate has to learn from the married, in the sense of, because that's how we come to know higher things through our human experience. And so a celibate person who's married God, right, who is the spouse of Christ, they have to look to married people to understand more what it means to be a spouse of Christ. And we see that, and there are many, there are thousands of examples of this. A beautiful example is in the liturgy itself, that the liturgy of the consecration of religious sisters uses a marriage veil. Right? The very liturgical form of the veil was to show that religious consecration is a marriage. Right? It's a marriage with the spouse of spouses. And religious look, a good example would be Saint Therese of Lisieux. She, in her Story of a Soul, her autobiography, she writes about how she was preparing for her final vows, her profession. And her cousin was getting married at that time. And so she compared herself with her cousin in preparation for the marriage. And so the cousin had to have a bridal dress. Well, she said, well, I need a bridal dress too, but not simply a physical one, but she needed, her bridal dress would be virtues. And so she needed to get some virtues, and of course she couldn't do that on her own, but she had to implore her spouse to get her this bridal dress that she would please him with, those virtues. And it's a beautiful, and then she imagined this wedding invitation that, I wish I had it here to read to you, but it's hysterical. She imagines inviting all to the espousal of Saint Therese of the infant Jesus with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the crucified Lord, etc. And so we know about higher things by analogy with what comes in our human experience. And so the experience of matrimony is absolutely fundamental also for all those who are called to religious life. And that's why Adam needed to experience human spousal love to fully understand his relationship with God. Right? And just as he needed to understand human paternity to rightly understand the divine paternity. Even though the divine paternity is first, right? In other words, God's the exemplar of all paternity, all maternity, and of all spousal love. But we come to understand it through the creaturely participation. Right? And so we go back to God in an inverse way. In other words, everything comes down from Him so that we can go back through the things that He's made back to Him. Right? So we take that spousal love in human affairs and as a path to God. And that's true for everyone, both the religious and the married person. We have to realize a marriage with God, because in heaven we're going to all be espoused to one, to Christ. And so all of us have to use the human experience of marriage, whether we personally are married or not, to help to bring us to marriage with Christ. And we'll have to look at, just as in every human marriage, there are so many self-sacrifices that have to be made. No, that one has to be constantly sacrificing one's own comfort for the beloved, for one's spouse and children. And that's going to be the model for any religious. If a religious thought of his celibacy as a kind of bachelorhood, That would be not a path of sanctification, to say the least. And so marriage also is a great path of sanctification by showing the sacrifice that's needed for love. Right? That love, by its very nature, is proven through self-renunciation for the beloved. And so in all of that, so for example, if somebody were to enter religious life because they didn't want to get up at 2 a.m. to feed the crying baby, or that would not be a good motivation. But rather the opposite. They ought to want to do that in a more heroic way still. In other words, you might become a priest so that you could get woken up at 2 a.m. for a call to a dying person, or a sick call, etc. Regarding the law and following it as a path to our end, I understand the moral law in terms of the Ten Commandments and those of Christ by which he interiorized the law. But what about the choices between goods, between different ministries to participate in, between different good works? How can we understand the law, the Torah, in terms of choices between goods? That's a great question. That God's will is conveyed to us. We learn, how do we know God's will? There's more than one way. One way that we know God's will is when it's directly expressed to us through the commandments. So that's the most evident expression of God's will. The written law, the Ten Commandments, but it's the Holy Spirit, the new law of Christ, by which we fully see the implications of that law, and by which we have the charity to do it as God wants it to be done. But what about, but that's again between good and evil. What about between goods? Here too God has a will. In other words, God has a particular will for each one of us. It's not as if he just has a general will of be good, follow the Ten Commandments. He has a particular will for each of us and a particular vocation. But of course, one of the most difficult things in life we've all experienced is discerning what that is. In other words, it's much more difficult to discern between goods. Right? Discerning between good and evil is easy. I mean, we know what we're supposed to do. We may not do it, but we know what we're supposed to do. But discerning between goods is much harder. And this requires greater spiritual discernment. But there is a will of God also in those particular goods. But we have to be attuned to it. And here we need a gift. It's the gift of counsel. One of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, by which we can grasp, not through human reason, but through a certain connaturality with God's will, in other words, through love, grasp what the beloved is leading us to. But God allows it, and so I say it's above human reason, because human reason alone isn't sufficient often to tell us what's the good that God wants us to pick between these various goods, because they're all good. Right? How do I know whether I'm supposed to, get married or enter a religious life or become a priest? That's not so easy. Right? They're all good. It would be easy if one of them were evil. And so human reason isn't enough. Human reason might suggest something, because of my temperament, because of my gifts, but that's insufficient, because God very often calls us to things that go, say, beyond our natural gifts, that we would think that we were the least gifted for. And he does that because in his supernatural works, he makes use of the weak things of the world so that it's manifested that it's from him and not from us. Right? So he very often calls people who might seem the least apt to do that. And so again, human reason wouldn't be able to figure it out. That's why we need the gift of counsel to be able to do it. And that's true with regard to our vocational life. It's also true with regard to more particular choices. Should I do this, graduate program or that one? Should I help be involved in this apostolate or that apostolate? Should I do this kind of help the poor or be involved in some other way of building up the church? And so the only way to find these things out, since it goes beyond human reason, is prayer. Right? There's no other way. So we have to pray about them. We have to bring them to prayer. And in prayer, try and follow some basic principles of discernment. And this, by the way, is one of the principal reasons that St. Ignatius of Loyola, by which God inspired him to write his spiritual exercises. One of the principal purposes of the spiritual exercise is precisely this: how we discern between goods. St. Ignatius divides the spiritual exercise into different weeks, and in the first week it's about good and evil. Right? So it's trying to get us to be sorry for the sin that we've done and to make a firm resolution to do good. But that's not the end of the exercises. That's the beginning, because the real fruit of the spiritual exercise is in what he calls the second week, in which he presupposes we've already renounced sin. But we want to choose a particular state of life. But we don't want to choose our will, we want to choose God's will. Right? And so, and here the devil can deceive us, not directly by putting forth sin like he did with Eve, but by putting forth goods, but not the goods that God's calling us to, other goods. Goods that are perfectly good in themselves, but they're not good for us because they're contrary to God's path for us. That's what the devil will do when a person is resolved to do good. He doesn't give up, right? And so he disguises himself as an angel of light. So how can we tell that? Well, it's a little complicated, but the principal criterion is the devil can counterfeit all kinds of things. He can counterfeit enthusiasm. He can counterfeit excitement and dreams of grandeur. But he can't counterfeit what he doesn't have, which is the peace that only God can give. Right? The devil can't counterfeit because he doesn't have any of it. And so that's the best means of discerning what God has truly is calling us to. That when we contemplate doing that, we get a peace. Now that peace may not come at all at first, because God, His goal is, we would like to get clarity right away, right? God doesn't want us to have clarity right away. And in fact, very often, He withholds the clarity until the last possible moment. Why? So that we walk by faith, right? It's a question of fidelity. So that we persevere even when we don't have the confirmation. In other words, we continue knocking and knocking and knocking, persevering until finally He'll give us the clarity at the right moment. But we have to trust in Him first, right? We have to trust that He'll give the clarity at the right moment, and that it's okay that it's the next to last moment, and I still don't know. So how do we choose between goods? In prayer, looking for that criterion, ultimately, of peace, and not giving up when we're feeling what St. Ignatius calls desolation. And a fundamental rule of the spiritual life is when we don't get that peace that we're looking for, that we don't change course. That in times of what he calls desolation, which would be when I don't feel God's presence, when I don't feel inspired, that in those times I should never change. In other words, never give up a good course taken, simply because I don't feel any consolation. But you should persevere until He grants that peace. Right, so that would be the way I would answer that. And that's one of the most difficult things in the spiritual life, and it's one of the most important things. Right? Discerning between goods. And we don't have to worry, because, He's in charge. He brings out good from everything. So even from our bad choices in the past, He's capable of bringing out an incredible good. Right? So we never have to think is, I look back at my past life and I see, that discernment I didn't make well. Right? That doesn't mean it's lost now, right? Because God brings forth from His providence good out of everything. Right? All things work together for good for those who love God. Right? Romans 8. On your handout, in the second account of creation, there's a quote of John Paul II, which speaks about Christ who manifests himself to be the truth. If God is the truth, is therefore all truth of God? And does this apply also to God is love and God is life? So is all love of God? And so the answer is yes, certainly. All truth, God is the truth. And therefore everything that's true is a participation of God's truth. It's from God. It's true because it's a participation of the Word, which is Christ. And that's why, among other things, this is why the science, there's always going to be harmony between faith and reason. Faith is God's revelation of His truth, but human reason is gifted by God with the capacity to see truth by the natural power of reason. And that truth that human reason finds, well, that's a truth from God because He's created the world, and it's a truth that will be in harmony with the truth that He's revealed. And so philosophy and theology always have to work together. The fathers of the church, the early fathers, St. Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, they would speak of Greek philosophy as being a preparation for the gospel. Right? And the idea is that God, who is the Word, Christ the Word, has scattered seeds of the Word, in other words, of reason, in all things. And that's simply creation. Everything that's God created, He created with order. And the very order that, say, the physicist is looking for in creation, that order is from God and is a kind of imitation of the divine order. A little imitation if we're talking about electrons. A big imitation if we're talking, say, about human nature and all the things in between that. And so whatever human reason can find out about the order of creation, right, is telling us about a likeness to God, a distant likeness or a closer likeness. And the philosophy of man is the most beautiful part, because it's a higher likeness to God, made in His image and likeness. And so all the truths that reason can know about from creation, sure, are from God and tell us about God. And that's how it works as a kind of ladder, right? So that philosophy is one of the best preparations for coming to faith. But it has to be good philosophy. Right? In other words, it has to be true philosophy, not something that's contrary to common sense. And so if a philosopher comes up with something that's colossally contrary to common sense, well, that's going to be a colossal obstacle to coming to the truth. But good philosophy will be a preparation. And it shows as a kind of ladder because it shows something about who God is through the things that He's made. That's the human way of coming to God. And the same thing is true of love, right? So God is love, and so all love is from God and leads back to God. But it has to be true love, right? And not something that is a counterfeit. In other words, we talked about this in an earlier talk, that love has many meanings because it has many levels. And it has many levels precisely because it serves as a ladder to get to God. And so the highest forms of love being love of benevolence, in other words, a self-giving to the beloved for their sake, not for my sake, that is the best path to get to God because God is precisely that. He's infinite self-giving. And the life of the Blessed Trinity is just that. An infinite, eternal self-gift of Father to Son and Son to the Father, and the Holy Spirit being the love proceeding between the two. And so all love is of God and leads to God. And that's why conversion very often happens in those two areas. So someone seeking the truth, say, in a serious and profound way, it's a great path of conversion, and through love, the experience of human love. And it could be the love that comes from the loss of a loved one, or the love at the birth of a loved one, or the love of entering into married life. Very often these are the experiences that lead people to God, right? Because God is love. And that's, of course, the whole of the gospel, right? The gospel is Christ who reveals who the Father is precisely by giving himself, right? That was the gospel for today. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Right? And so everything in the gospel, the incarnation, and above all the passion, is revealing to us the total self-giving, right? Total revealing the love of God, so as to lead us to want to give ourselves back to him. What are some of the current theories of the origin of man? Space alien? Existing creatures somehow graced by God, immediate creation, or evolution from lower species, then graced? Okay, this is, obviously I'm not going to be able to answer this in 5 minutes. But we'll have a talk on this, God willing, in the fall. And we'll get rid of what we can get rid of. Space alien. So to think, if somebody supposes, well, the origin of life is something so improbable by chance alone that it couldn't have happened just by itself, and so therefore it's much more reasonable to think that there was maybe some alien spore that landed on the earth, and there's something reasonable about that, because at least they've seen that just chance alone is not going to be sufficient. So there's an admission there of defeat. But then, of course, there's a problem, right? Where did that alien spore come from, and how did it form? By chance alone? So the origin of life by chance alone is ultimately, you need to look at the mathematics. But there's a basic philosophical principle, and that's, well, you can't give what you don't have. Right? And we experience this every day of our lives. We can't, and this is, for one, I mean, there's so many illustrations of this. You can't give, say, an apostolate, you can't give holiness if you don't aspire to it, at least. If you don't work at it yourself. You can't give what you don't have. And so, how could an inanimate thing be the sufficient cause to give life? Even if you have, a lightning bolt and this primordial soup and all kinds of protein swimming around in it, you can't give what you don't have. And the most primitive form of life has an order that is colossal, that is absolutely staggering. And what's so interesting is that the more science probes into, say, life, the more complex we see that it is. The more, but not just complex, but the more I'm speechless. The order is so staggering, is so broad. I mean, it's so beautiful. Now, I'm a total novice. I'm a layman, but biologists, microbiologists who study the simplest biological things that exist, things like amoebas, they're so perfectly constructed. And they've got these different parts, and lots of them, incredible numbers of different parts, and they have to be perfectly coordinated, all of those different parts. And if one is failing, the whole thing doesn't work. And so to say, well, that could just happen by chance, and if you say, well, okay, that's very unlikely, and they say, well, just throw in more time, right? That doesn't help, because the more time gives more time for that order to be lost, right? Just as it's like people are looking for alien life, no? And so we're sending out, we're looking at all different planets, looking at Mars, etc. Imagine on Mars you just found the simplest aspect of order. Suppose you found 9 holes in the ground forming some perfect geometric figure. What would you think? There was intelligent life on Mars, right? Because you found 9 holes in the ground in an order. Or there's a movie, I forget the name of it. It was a movie funded by people looking for life in outer space. And in the film, they found this radio signal that was in the series of prime numbers. 1, 3, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. I forget I don't remember the primes. But if you found this radio signal giving all the primes from 1 to 100, you wouldn't think that was random, right? You'd say, there's an intelligence sending these radio signals. Life in outer space. All right, which is more order? These prime numbers from 1 to 100, these 9 holes in the ground, or even say you found a car on Mars, and you found a rusty car, you'd think there was intelligent life. All right, what has more order? The amoeba, or the prime numbers, or the car? Right? The amoeba has so immensely more order. And, I mean, you could go on and show how that's the case. And so it's as if if you saw, nobody would think that the basilica here was formed by chance, right? By the chance of some waves and wind and maybe a tornado producing the basilica. But that's what we're saying about the origin of life, by chance alone. But so much less, because this basilica, it's pretty incredible, but it can't reproduce itself. It can't nourish itself. It can't do a single vital action, right? But the simplest amoeba does all of that. And the best thing is the DNA. It's even the atheist scientist calls it a code, right? The genetic code. Well, code is a language. Well, language implies intelligence, right? There's got to be an intelligence that speaks and understands. And so if life is communicated through this code, right, that's a clear sign of design. Anyway, we could go on and on, but life everywhere shows all the signs of design. And that's true at its first appearance, and it's true at every increase, at every step. And that's why Genesis 1 is so beautiful, by showing us the stages, right? That's the 6th day is really important. That God didn't create it all at once, zap. But there are stages, and the higher presupposes the earlier, but each step up isn't going to happen by chance, right? Because you can't give what you don't have. And so each added step is another work of design. How God did it, how He implemented His design is another question. But what's absolutely certain is every step of the way, you've got a divine design. All right, if that's true of every step, is it going to be true of the final step by which man first appears? Well, of course, and much more so, right? Because in what differentiates man from, say, the chimp, you've got an immortal soul. You've got a spiritual soul made out of nothing by God alone. Right? And so it's not as if the chimp could just kind of become a man just by himself, because he's never going to make his daughter or son have an immortal spiritual soul if he doesn't have one. Right? How is he going to? And even we who have them, we can't give them to our children, the immortal soul. God has to make it out of nothing. In other words, God has to intervene in every human conception. So of course He had to intervene in the first conception. Right? So there's no question that in the first man, God had to make an intervention that was discontinuous, creating a soul out of nothing. All right, that's for man's soul. What about man's body? Well, here the Church allows discussion. And Pius XII allowed there to be discussion on this question, whether the human body could be considered the product of evolution. The human soul can't, but could the body? He allowed discussion, but and so we can voice our opinion, and it seems to me that the human body, likewise, requires some direct intervention of God, because a chimp body is adapted to a chimp soul. Right? An orangutan body and the orangutan soul go together. And if you look at primates and any other animal, they're always adapted to very particular circumstances, very particular environments. And they've got special tools for that particular environment. Right? So they might have fingers and toes to swing on trees, or whatever it may be. But man is precisely without those things. Right? We're coming to the world naked and unprovided for, and without any of those natural things that would adapt us to a particular environment. And why is that? Because we're rational animals, and through reason and hands, we can adapt ourselves to any environment. But that's only true if we have reason. So a chimp without reason, just internal senses, his body is always going to be specialized to a particular environment. And the human body has to be different. It has to be different in kind from any other animal. And so I don't see how it could be the human body could be purely the product of an evolution. Even granting that God makes the soul out of nothing in the first case. But anyway, we can come back to this at a later moment. One last comment here. Maria Montessori said, the young child is looking in the world to find him or herself reflected in the mirror of 1,000 faces. What a beautiful comment, that the child comes to, in early education, it's precisely that contact with the other faces, right? That we come to consciousness also of ourselves and who we are. And that's kind of what we were talking about with Adam in his original solitude. Adam needed the experience of Eve. First he needed the experience of the animals to see that he wasn't them and he was more. And then he needed the experience of Eve to discover his vocation to love, to give of himself. Right? And so every child needs that experience of love, above all in the human family. Right? That's why God created the family with the structure that it has, with complementary parents. And then, ideally with brothers and sisters, in which we discover ourselves precisely through that contact, that interpersonal contact with other faces. Very beautiful. Okay, well, any other questions? Thank you very much. And next time the talk will be on the spousal nature of man. We'll look into that in greater depth.